Hello, and welcome to Pique My Interest, a podcast dedicated to creativity. My name is Scoob Decker, and I am an artist, and your host. PMI is an exploration in meeting some incredible artists, learning about their craft, and exploring what makes them create. We end Season 3 with the incredible fiber sculpture artist Stephanie Metz. She is a pioneer in the craft, as it is a pretty recent art form. She has mastered needle felting, a craft to continuously poke fibers with tools to create shapes. In the past 50 years, this style is usually done for cute critters or objects. In her words, Stephanie's work is not cutesy. Her world-class work brings an intense and obscure approach to this craft. The bizarre creatures and sculptures resemble lifelike organisms as they reflect her fascination with biology and natural life, and how people make sense of the world around them. It is a very forgiving craft and lightweight. At any point you can add or take away from your artist's vision. In the episode, she dives into the accessibility of the craft, how people with a visual impairment can also experience it. You can hold it, touch it, feel it, hug it. And has created a whole exhibit for the hanging pods to do just that. The kinesthetic touching creates a connection to the piece, and she says that sculpting is problem solving. She dives into the idea that everyone will get something different out of the art form. Two people can experience two different feelings from the same piece. She believes you have to give yourself the patience to be bad at something long enough to get good at it. Stephanie is patient and curious and will always lean into wonder. This episode was recorded on July 14th in San Jose, California. I hope you can look up their work and your interest is piqued. I hope you're having a grand day, and please enjoy this week's episode I've titled, Every Poke Makes a Difference. Hello, and welcome to Pique My Interest. I am currently in San Jose, sitting in this really unique and super cool studio with an amazing artist. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well, thank you.
You doing anything interesting lately?
Yes, I am working like crazy on a solo show that's going to be opening in September, and I still have a lot of work to do. So I'm in here a lot, working on various different parts of it.
Thank you for taking the time to meet with me. But before we get into all of that, please, introduce yourself. What is your name and where are you from?
I'm Stephanie Metz. I am a sculptor based here in San Jose, California. I grew up nearby in Sunnyvale, went to college in Oregon, ended up back down here, and now this is where my life is. I work on sculpture. I am married to a wonderful man. I have 2 teenage sons, and I'm really intrigued by the natural world and the concept of wonder and curiosity, and just, how even just simple things in life can really inspire interest. And that's what I try to capture with my work.
Yeah, I think you do. Let's learn a little bit about your sculpture work. What is your specialty within your craft?
So I'm a sculptor who works primarily with fiber. And the 2 main ways that I work with fiber are through needle felting, which is where you stab at wool fibers with special notched needles so you can shape the fibers into 3-dimensional forms. And I've been doing that for about 20 years and really honing my craft at it, although my background is in much more traditional materials of clay and stone and a little bit of wood. But I use a lot of those techniques to make the forms that I make in felt. And then lately I'm also using some pre-made industrial felt or design felt and stitching it into 3-dimensional forms.
Excellent. And what makes your work different than others who also work in fiber sculpting?
I think it's partly the subject matter and so I'm very inspired by nature and natural history museums and just the different, parts and pieces of biology. And I try to kind of capture those, and so the forms I make are very organic. They're very mysterious, a little bit familiar, but also a little bit off. And I think that my work is also very visceral and sometimes sometimes funny, sometimes kind of dark. So sort of taking all that together. And I think especially with needle felting, if people have seen it done, it's more in the capacity of, dolls and toys. So, kind of cutesy little things. And my work is not cutesy.
I look at your work, and as I said earlier, I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to feel with all of it, but I can safely say that each one of your pieces definitely evokes a feeling. And I just want to say thank you for that, because they all just definitely give you a sense of something, and whether or not that be a little creepy or maybe a little soft or maybe a little rough or vulgar, like you might have said, I think it's very unique, and I think it's stunning. So thank you for that. What is your upbringing that turns you into a creator?
I was a kid who was drawing since I was able to hold a pencil. My mom remembers when I was about 5 that I drew horses running across the page, but they were entering from one side and exiting the other. So I was treating the paper even then, not as an object, but as like a window. And I was also a horse crazy kid. Like, I loved animals. I still do. And so I paid close attention to what they look like. I loved going to natural history museums because I'm just fascinated by biology, and the architecture that underlies life is really interesting to me. But also how people interpret that. I remember reading early on about how, like, when elephant skull was first found and someone thought, way back in history, people assumed that it was a cyclops, because there's a huge opening in the front of an elephant skull where the trunk comes out. But of course, we interpret the world depending on our own belief systems. And then there was, the head of I think a pretty large femur where it had like kind of 2 ball part sections. Right, yeah. And because people didn't have a concept yet of dinosaurs, they thought that was from the manly parts of a past giant, because that's more believable than a dinosaur. Yeah. Oh, but so I love just looking at the history of how people make sense of the world around them, and the different ways, even just what you put in a natural history museum and how you contextualize it. Even from an early age, I was interested in that. And I think I always knew I was going to be an artist. I just didn't know what form that would take. And when I was, as a young person, I didn't really feel like I wasn't that attracted to the idea of being a studio or a gallery artist, because I didn't feel like I had a point of view that mattered. I didn't know, I didn't have a stance. And in college, I was studying really classical forms of art, working from the human figure in clay, doing some carving, a lot of really, I wanted the really classical education in the traditional media, but I didn't know what I wanted to do with it until I realized I kind of wanted to work in animatronic movie effects. I wanted to make sculpture that could kind of move and help tell a story. And I did a little bit of animation in college as well. And when I was trying to find work in that realm, I ended up working for a themed environment company that made, so you want to go buy your electronics at the electronics store? Well, this one is a Mayan temple, and you enter through the pseudo stone building. And so the company that I worked for a year made that kind of stuff. So I was wielding a hedger trimmer chainsaw and carving huge blocks of styrofoam, like 8-foot by 8-foot blocks of styrofoam. And then they would coat it with cement or with urethane and paint it. And we'd do these faux painting on things, which was kind of close to what I thought I wanted to do, but ended up being a lot different than what I actually wanted to do. Just working, having someone tell you what to make and how to make it, and then you make it that way, and then they have a change, and then you change it, and then they have another change. And working, in a team, it didn't, for making things, it just didn't suit me. But then I was sort of at sea because I didn't know what I was going to do. And I worked for a framing company for a little while to just kind of be around art and figure out what I wanted to do. Started getting involved in a nonprofit art and performance space and ended up joining their board. And so being around art and artists, learning how to hang a show, speak in front of groups, do PR kind of stuff. But I also then stumbled across needle felting, and that sort of changed everything. I had a coworker at the frame shop who showed me a magazine article on making felted drink cozies. So you take a cup and you wrap it in wool and you dunk it in hot soapy water and you rub it a lot, and it'll be this freestanding cup made of felt. So that's wet felting. It's a very traditional way to make wool into felt. So felt is a non-woven textile. And they have examples of it, from the Mongolian steppes, making yurts out of it. But they even have an example from a tomb from 4500 BC. It's called the Scythian swan, and it's a three-dimensional swan that's made of felted wool. Wet felting, because that's what people would do back then. So it's been around a really long time. But when I decided to try playing with it, I was out of school. I had nowhere to really work on anything. I wanted to be carving things. I was doing some printmaking, but I had no way to make three-dimensional forms, which is what is really my language. And so I went to a yarn store and I said, I want to try this felting thing. And the woman there said, you don't want to do wet felting. It's messy and imprecise. Here's a book on needle felting. So in this book, there's these pictures of like toadstools and fairies, and it includes a couple of felting needles, which are these steel, like 4-inch long needles that are very sharp and have little notches cut in the business end. And when you stab into a loose, fluffy mass of fiber and you poke at it repeatedly, the little notches catch on the fiber and cause them to jam against each other. So you can basically shape loose, fluffy wool almost like clay in your hands, depending on the direction that you're poking in. And all of a sudden, this wasn't going to be my real art because I'd never heard of this. And I think even I had this idea in my head that fiber art was somehow less than stone or metal or whatever. Because, you're taught growing up that these like crafty things, they call it women's work for the reason that, it's the kind of thing where the clay or the paint isn't drying. So when you're working in those things, you need to have a lot of focused time. But when you're working in these other fiber materials, you can put that aside while you care for your home and your children and feed people and all this stuff, then pick it up later. So it was meant to be sort of a derogatory term in some ways, but I've come to find that that's pretty wonderful that I can put things down and pick them up again. Like the whole idea of craft being less than art because it's more focused on function and how you do things is just ridiculous words. And once I stumbled across needle felting, I realized that the things that I'm interested in, so the forms, the biological specimens, the way people shape the world around them through breeding, etc., of different creatures, that's interesting to me. I can replicate that or play with that with my material, and that can be the direction that I go in. It's the thing that I'm the most interested in.
Yeah.
And I think it takes finding an end to what you're really interested in, because if you want to go deep on something, there's probably other people that are interested in what you're doing too.
Yeah, you mentioned that this craft has been around for a long time, but I have a question in my sheet that I've never actually asked anybody and piqued my interest, but because it's a very recent art form, can you give us a little bit of the history of fiber sculpting?
So with this kind of material, with this tool, again, the needle or wet felting has been around since humans, domesticated sheep. But needle felting, using the needle to work freeform in the round to shape wool into felt, is only about 50 years old. The tools themselves have been around since the Industrial Revolution, where they'd have huge machines in factories that would have hundreds of these needles, each coming down into... Here, I'll work as I go. So I'm poking at the wool with a felting needle right now. So in a factory, there would be a machine with hundreds of these needles, each going down into their own little hole, and you would feed wool and other mixed textiles into the machine, and the fibers would be tangled and flattened and matted by these needles going up and down, repeatedly sort of chewing into it. And depending on how long it's in the machine or how much fiber you put in the machine, you could adjust the density of the fiber and the thickness of the fiber. And this is true even today. There is still a huge use for industrial felt. It's used for sound dampening, vibration dampening, wicking liquids from here to there. Think of a felt tip pen. But also for sound, like there's felt inside of pianos because it softens the sound. It's inside the doors of cars because it minimizes rattling. So there's all these different things, like reasons to use felt, and that can sort of play into what you do with it conceptually. But so about 50 years ago is when a couple of artists started playing with the felted needle by hand. I need to double check this, but I think their names are Elaine and David Stanwyck. She first started playing with a felting needle to make small kind of jewelry size pieces by poking at wool. And then the two of them, their friend Ayala Talpai came to visit, and she's the one who wrote the book that I came across. So she started using it to make little, dolls and toys and things like that, and wrote a book about how to use it. And so it's sort of, been around for maybe, I think it's about 50 years that people have been doing this. But what that means is that it's wide open to whatever, there's no rules here. This is still the Wild West of playing with this stuff. Because in so many other fiber techniques, there are very rigid, structured ways of doing it. And if you're not doing it in the right way, then you're not doing it. For example, lace making, weaving, like there are very long histories and lots of different histories of ways to do it, but there are really set ways. Whereas with needle felting, you're basically stabbing at the wool and poking it into whatever the heck shape you want. So there's not a lot of rigid ways to do it. And for me, I think I bring into it my background in clay, which is adding on material. But while I'm adding on fiber, I'm also compressing it down and tightening it down. So it's also sort of like carving away. And I've done stone carving as well. But it's also like joining metal to metal by either riveting through one material to the other. But then it's also so forgiving because at any stage you can cut back into it and change it. And you can make it very, very lightweight and yet still hold its shape. An early piece I made was a jackrabbit where the ears are very tall and slender, but I made them very dense in the places where the cartilage would be. And then I used wire, so I made the thing almost complete, and then I cut into the legs, cut a channel into each of the four legs, and embedded a wire, and then closed it up again by poking around it. And so those wires came out the bottom, and I could put them on a base. So, I didn't need structure in the ears, but with the legs to keep it up, I did. But so minimal and just so strange that you could go in at the end and embed an armature back inside of a thing and, following where the skeletal system would be. So taking a cue from nature to figure out how to support this thing. But it just means it's so wide open. And because, especially when I started, you couldn't really look online and find, I've been doing this for about 20 years, you couldn't find a lot of examples of people working in this medium. And so there was, it was a lot of blaze your own path, figure out what you're going to do with it. What can you do? How thin can you make it? Can light come through it? Can it hold its own structure? A lot of just playing to learn, experimentation.
I can definitely get that sense that you're experimenting, you're playing. And like I said, everything in here just evokes something inside of you, and you play with a little bit of color. You're playing with shapes and forms. You have some flat pieces. You have some 3D pieces. You have some wall hangings. You have some things that are 15 feet tall. You have some things that are 3 inches tall. You have so many different series. To me, it seems like you're pretty successful. What is success in your craft?
Yeah.
And what really got you succeeding in your craft?
I feel pretty successful, but it's that whole thing where you always are striving for, moving forward too. So for me, I think part of it, and I think you can't avoid talking about the financial part of it, because as an artist, everyone assumes that, you're doing this because you're passionate about it, but being passionate about something doesn't pay for the studio rent. So there's definitely a piece of it where it's, are people interested enough in what I'm doing that they want to collect some of the work or learn from me, which are the ways that I am able to fund all this. So, for me, the best, success is being able to have everything in place that I can just make the things that I want to make. Like, that is heavenly. My materials are not terribly expensive. I'm managing as I go now to make it all work where I can, rent this lovely space and create what I want to create and have people come to me looking to show my work. And, when you're starting out as a visual artist, you're often trying to get your work seen by the world by applying to juried shows and submitting and I'm at the point now where more and more venues are coming to me to want to show the work that I have. So, for example, these huge touchable pieces that, I basically pitched the idea of this to a local museum several years ago, and they took me up on it, and so I had the show there. And then now I have other venues approaching me about showing those works. And that feels really, really wonderful, because the whole point of this, especially the work that I've done that's meant to be touchable by the public, is to have it be interacted with, to have to cause people to pause for a moment in their lives and just be really present. Like, I feel like that's the pinnacle when you are, at least to me, as a visual artist, if I can connect with people, I'm not there, but connecting with people, causing them to take a moment to pause and be thoughtful, or, just take them out of their lives for a brief moment, that's really exciting to me. And I do know that, most people won't ever see my work in person because there are so many people in the world and only so many venues you can, have things in. So even trying to communicate it through video and through photos. But I do feel successful in that I get to follow what I'm interested in and keep experimenting and playing. And I really love the interactions with people that I have because of the things that I put out in the world. Yeah. I feel like it's a way to find kindred spirits. And not everybody is, and that's fine. If I was making things that everybody uniformly loved, I don't even know what that would be, but I don't think it'd be that interesting. I think it's more intriguing to just follow what's interesting to me and see who else I connect with because of that.
Yeah. I think earlier you were talking about the connections and maybe even the lack of connections. Some people saying that there's a female forms, and I just think it's so unique that other people can feel these things and maybe even get angry at it, or they might get a different feeling.
Well, and I get a lot of that. I do open studios a couple times a year, and what that means is I open my studio along with a lot of the other artists in this complex, and we invite the public to come in and see what we're working on. Often I'll demonstrate things as I'm going, and I have a lot of work, around the space, and I get to really get immediate feedback, which is interesting. Everybody sees the world through their own filter of their life experiences. And so no two people are going to look at anything that I make and see it the same exact way. And my work is not that representational. Some of it is. I have some, fairly recognizable human forms and animal forms, but a lot of it is sort of a blend, and I'm borrowing from things and pushing things in different directions. And I don't always know what other people will say and what they'll see. I have a piece on the wall that's a blend of, it's a felt piece that has sort of a cavity in it, but coming out of that cavity are porcupine quills, which are also a fiber. They're also, a modified hair of a porcupine. They are ridiculously sharp on both ends. I've played with them in contrast and in combination with the felt work, partly because I love that while the felt looks warm and inviting and draws you closer, the porcupine quills really have a different message. And that piece was hanging in a show in downtown San Jose years ago, in this show that it was called Femme Fatale. We had all work that had to do with the female experience. And at the opening night, the doors are open, people could just kind of wander in and take a look. And these 3 teenage boys came in and just sort of breezed through, but one of them stopped in front of that piece and he looked at that. And mind you, it's this kind of blobby form hanging on the wall with sort of a inset cavity with scary spikes coming out. And he turns to me, he says, "Did you make this?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Do you know what this looks like?" Like, he was angry. I was like, I guess not. No. And he just turned and ran away in a huff. Like, the other boys gave me dirty looks and ran away. And I was like, wait, oh, they're seeing, I honestly had no idea that someone might see this as a vulva kind of form that might be dangerous. But okay, so now I also see it that way. But it was so interesting to me that I combine forms and materials and things that are intriguing or weighty or interesting in different ways, but I don't know how other people will take them. Yeah. Sometimes it's upsetting to people, I guess. I don't know. It's interesting to me.
I guess as an artist, you're doing your job.
I guess. I mean, I don't set out to provoke, and I know that there are people where that is a goal in some ways. And I think I like more subtlety than that. Yeah. I like to make things that make you think, or you have to kind of chew on a little bit longer, or it's not a very clear thing.
It's not in your face, and that's what I really like about it. It's that subtlety, that softness to it, and I think it's about time we start talking about your creation process. First of all, where do you get your ideas?
A lot of it is really just observing life day to day, which might sound weird, but so I would walk my dog every day and pay attention to things. Like I don't know, like a seed pod, or the way, I would walk her along this, human-made stream kind of thing. And there's one part where the concrete abutment has this beautiful, strange compound curve. Like things like that. I notice things. I'm a noticer. I'm someone who pays attention to what I pay attention to, if that makes sense. So it can be, the curve and of the human form. It can be just anything. It can be all sorts of different things. And when I'm sitting down to make things, often it's a spark of something that I've seen, the way I really like folds of flesh, like soft and, well, I guess I also like bony things that are very rigid, and the combination of those. So I'm just really intrigued by how things look and how they make you feel because of how they look. And so, for example, for this show that's coming up, it's featuring works that are more blatantly focused on the feminine in terms of almost redefining or expanding the definition of what is feminine. So I'm using this crazy, insane, bright pink pigment too, which is kind of unusual for me, and bouncing color off of it, but also doing these forms that I think read as more, they're curvy, but they're strong, and they're bold, and they're delicate, like all that wrapped together. And so when I'm, sitting down to figure out what I'm going to make for that, it's a lot of, I do some sketching. I often have, some ideas, but I also work it out as I am working because my process takes some time. For this show, I'm doing a combination of, I have freestanding wool sculptures that are made through the stabbing with the needles. And those, I've got some sketches, but I also sort of work them out as I go. I have these stitched wall pieces, so I'm using this smooth industrial felt and stitching forms together and mounting them on stretcher bars. So these wall pieces also have some of this reflected pink component. But then the central part of this show is a hugely experimental, monumental size thing that I'm trying, which are these 16 feet tall by 20 feet wide, these 6 kind of column, roughly column-like forms that, again, read as these undulating different shapes that allude to kind of the female form, but they're just made of stitched hanging felt. So their form comes from the fact that I've cut the pattern pieces and stitched them together, and they're going to be hanging on these shaped metal pieces. And this huge thing is going to be hanging 10 feet out from the wall that will be bright, intensely pink. So you can walk around this, and what from the front looks concave, from the back will be convex and have this pink reflecting off of it. And it's so crazily, ridiculously experimental. I'm familiar, I have a lot of material knowledge with what I'm doing, but I've never done this before. And it's been a whole adventure. Like with that, it's a lot of pre-planning. I think sometimes people don't realize that when you are making art, there is so much problem solving. And that's what's really fun for me. The problem solving is the fun of it, because I know that I want to make a thing that acts or looks like this. How am I going to achieve that? What is it going to take to do it? And there's a lot of engineering involved. And you wear a lot of different hats, and you borrow the brains of other people as you need. But it's a lot of just having a vision for what you want to experiment with. I want to learn from this. The reason I'm making this huge thing is that I want to have more opportunities to go and make huge things. And I want to know, can I use this fairly lightweight, fairly accessible material that is, seen in a certain way? Can I change the context of it by how I manipulate it and how I present it? But I also really love that I think by virtue of my materials, I think my work is pretty accessible and not, snooty, you need to know a lot to understand this work. I really want it to be approachable. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is using these more familiar materials makes it more approachable. And that is something I'm really interested in. One of my studio neighbors here, it's like a kind of like a UPS store down the hall. And I was talking to him the other day, and he said, so you're making this up? Like, have you done this kind of thing before? And I said, no, that's part of the fun. I'm totally experimenting. And he said, I'm not an art person at all, but I really like what you're doing. I said, well, that's good, because I don't want it to be just for people who are art people. I want to, draw people in to be intrigued and engaged regardless of their experience. And I'm not trying to dictate what you get out of it either. I just, I think curiosity and wonder are really important things in life. And I think it's easy to be jaded and feel like you've seen everything and you know everything. And I love that sort of childlike, oh, what is this?
I think that exhibit that you were just talking about, as well as your In Touch series with the giant hanging pieces, I think you've also made it accessible for the visually impaired as well.
Yes.
Being able to just go up and touch something.
Right.
And be able to feel it and be able to get that same emotion, that same feeling, when you wouldn't be able to do that with a Van Gogh.
Right. And you think about how inaccessible art museums are if you are visually impaired. It's kind of a crazy thing that we who are sighted rely so much on that. When I was first proposing this idea to the De Sausset Museum at Santa Clara University of these touchable pieces, they were really excited, but also like, okay, how are we going to present this? Because usually, obviously, you can't touch things in museums. And having these be blatantly touchable, I mean, we made some concessions of, well, there's going to be docents in the rooms. You don't want people to get rough with the things that you're making, but also cleanliness. Most of what I do is in white wool, so you want to keep it clean. Mind you, this was before COVID.
That's my next
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. So we had hand sanitizer at the entrance to each of the 2 gallery spaces because, shared public textiles. You don't think about how often you actually have experienced shared public textiles without thinking of it. Now, post-COVID, it's hard not to think about it. And people were really excited to touch these things. Partly because, the reason this even came about was that, so for years people have wanted to touch my work. I'd be at an opening and there'd be people kind of hovering over a piece. You could tell they just really wanted to confirm with their hands what their eyes were telling them because it looks soft and fuzzy and a little bit squishy. And if I was present, I'd say, hey, I'm the artist. If your hands are clean, you can go ahead and touch it. And I noticed again and again that people would, when they got to touch the work, they would turn to the person next to them and exclaim over it. Whether or not that was someone they came with or a total stranger. I thought that was pretty amazing. And so in 2016, with election stuff, I come from a very politically divided family, which is painful. And, our community, our nation, everyone was kind of divided and polarizing. And I was thinking, okay, as an artist, what is my role here? I don't want to make art about the divisions because I don't want to bathe in division every day. You are what you pay attention to. And it struck me that, well, if I can bring people together, I was reminded that, when people get to touch these things, they seem to connect. So what if I do that in a radically bigger way, in a more obvious way? And so I conceived of this idea of these radically touchable pieces that would hopefully cause people to connect with the other humans in the room, but, with me as the maker, if that came up. But to try to make some things that would connect people. So I made these 12 mysterious forms that look kind of like cocoons, kind of like seed pods, sort of familiar, sort of not, that people are invited to come touch. And some of them were squishier, some of them were more rigid. And to make these forms, so I do a lot of stabbing of wool, which takes a lot of time. So for these 12 human-sized forms, I instead decided to invite people to come help me. So I had to do a lot of engineering and figuring out how to make the forms, first of all. So I used thick industrial felt and I stitched the basic forms and filled them with either soft and squishy filler or expanding spray foam from the hardware store so it would be rigid but lightweight. And then the next step was to stab the white wool all across the outer surfaces of these. So I invited people, from my community to come in and take part in felting parties. So on a, given Saturday, I'd have the different forms, sitting across the different tables, and people would come in and I'd show them how to use the tools. And we would just have this lovely day of chatting about all sorts of different things and making connections even in the making phase. And people were so excited to get to, be involved in a real art project because a lot of the people had no art background, but they didn't need it. And so that was pretty fantastic to, even though, so the show went up in January of 2020. If you may recall, COVID landed upon us in March of 2020. So while the show was meant to be up for 6 months, it was only up for 2 months. And then it all closed, and that was pretty sad. But, one of my ways of dealing with that, professional and personal disappointment was, I wasn't able to do the artist talk that I would have done. So I made a documentary version of it and put it on my YouTube channel. And in doing that, reviewing all the videos and photos of, all that fun problem solving of figuring this out, but also having all the people come help me, it was very healing to kind of be reminded that it's not just about having the work out there, the making of it and the connecting with people that way was really important too. And so it ended up, and now those works are traveling to various venues, years later, which is really fun because their whole point is to get them out there. And so they're tactile. And as we record this, in a week, they're going to be picked up for a show in San Francisco, the Tactile Art Exhibition, which was conceived of as a way for people who are visually impaired to get to engage with art. It's open to other people as well, but it's the pinnacle of what this is about, getting to learn by touch and experience by touch, especially if you can't see. It's a pretty fantastic thing.
Yeah, you've created a kinesthetic art out of a visual art for not only yourself, but for the audience, as well as other people that get to help work with you. I love that. I think it's great. But the way you've explained it, it's kind of like the ultimate craft. In ceramics and clay, you get to add. In marble sculpting, you get to cut out and grind away. But with this, you've explained that you get to cut out, add, create, shape, form. How much does it adapt and change while you're working? Do you stick to your guns with your original idea? Or do you allow it to build with you?
I allow it to build with me. I have a pretty good understanding of how it behaves at this point, and yet I can still sometimes be surprised by things. And so I'll have, sometimes I'll have a clear idea of what I'm going to make. Sometimes it's sort of, I grow it as I go, and I know that I can change it at any moment. Sometimes it really takes guts to cut back into something when it's looking almost finished. Mm-hmm. But part of why I teach also is because it's really fun. I feel like I always learn more when I teach based on, other people's approaches or their questions or the way I find a new and different way to describe what I'm doing. And it's interesting. I'm often trying to hold my students back from getting to the surface finish too soon, because once you have a beautiful smooth surface finish, you're much less likely to be willing to change and cut into it if there's some structural or form problem. But it really is just such a free form, forgiving thing. I love that about it, that you can change it at any time. Mm-hmm. The other day I was working on a piece at home, and I ended up realizing that I needed to, fundamentally change a big part of it. So I had to basically tear part of it back, cut into it, totally change it, knowing in the back of my mind that I can make this work. I mean, there's that, famous slope drawing of a project where you start out and you're thinking, oh, this is great. This is pretty exciting. This is going to work. And then you get partway through, you're like, I don't know if this is working right. And then you get to the point of like, oh crap, what am I doing? Am I even an artist? Oh no. And then you kind of come back up again. Oh, okay, yeah, this is working. This is good. I definitely have that with parts of different things, especially my huge monumental thing where, again, I'm making it up as I go. But when I'm needle felting and poking at the wool, I have a lot of confidence that I'll get it to where I want it to get because I have a lot of experience by now with that. But it's still, it's still exciting to kind of see the directions it goes. But then again, there's parts of it that are so boring. I mean, when I'm doing the surface finishes, I'm just working across the surface to make everything smooth. But that's where audiobooks and podcasts come in, because sometimes it's the story that brings me along. Because, my gosh, in any job, in any craft, in any art form, there's going to be parts that are really fun and satisfying, and there's going to be parts that are just boring and you hate them. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of being a successful artist is making things, getting into the studio and making things, and working through the fact that some parts of this are really annoying to do. And I also feel like I don't tend to have a shortage of, I don't get a lot of artist block kind of thing. I don't seem to have that because I only have so many hours in the day. And I never have enough time to do the making thing. So I feel like I always have a few things in the pipeline that I want to be working on. And there's always new things to explore. And there's other things like completely separate from needle felting that I love to do too. Every year for a week, I get to go to this sculpture symposium, the California Sculpture Symposium, in Cambria, California, which is primarily a stone carving group. But I first knew about it because they invited me to come teach there. So I got to teach needle felting for part of the day and work on carving stone and work on carving wood. And so now I've treated myself the last 2 years to just going as a student. So I just get a week to work on something completely different that still dovetails, nicely with the kind of forms. I have one of the stone pieces over there, which has very similar kind of form to the things that I do in felt. So I feel like there's a lot of, there's always stuff churning and always more to do, even if some of it's more forgiving than others. The stone, not so forgiving.
You're answering a lot of my questions as we're going along, so maybe we'll just briefly touch on these. I will say, as Stephanie's talking about her craft, she has the biggest smile in the world. Can I just ask you, what inspires you? What gets your creative juices flowing?
Oh, gosh. All sorts of things.
And this kind of leads into, do you have any hobbies?
Well, okay, so I really just enjoy the physical making of things. I mean, it brings me a lot of pleasure and I feel like I'm sort of riding the crest of the wave. I know where I'm going with it, and I have to do the work to get there, but I know I'm going to get there. So even just the actual construction of things and the problem solving is very satisfying to me. That's just always fit my personality. And there's one reason I'm not a huge fan of some of the AI generated images I see is because if you already knew what things were going to look like, what's the fun of making them? Like, I feel like it's like a shortcut. Like, I get so excited to see how the thing is going to be, and that kind of keeps me, going in it. So the process itself is really inspiring to me. I mentioned that, I get a lot of inspiration just from the normal world around me on dog walks and stuff. Well, my dog passed away in March, and it was a day before her 4th birthday, and it had been a 3-week long, like I can talk about it now without sobbing, but she suddenly had an autoimmune disease. And over 3 weeks, she went from a totally healthy, happy, wonderful dog to death's door, basically, despite everything that we did. And that, so walking my dog was a big part of my life. Every morning I'd take her for an hour-long walk, and I just, observe things, and just the joy of, having this fun, responsive, smart dog with me. And then we got her during COVID, so she was a COVID puppy. So we met a lot of other people in our neighborhood through, who also had COVID puppies. There were a lot of them, we even wore masks outside all the time then. For the first probably 6 months to a year that I knew some of these people, I'd never seen their smiling faces. I remember the first time I was walking my dog and I saw one of my friends with her dog, but she didn't have her mask on, and we smiled at each other, and I had never seen her smile before.
Who are you?
It was amazing. But so that was a big part of my life. And I really love, I think dog training is kind of a hobby for me because I love animal behavior stuff. So I did a lot of clicker training with my dog, which is where you're emphasizing, you're capturing the behaviors that you want to emphasize having more of them. And she was a very smart dog. She was a Border Collie, Australian Shepherd mix. So, there's just a lot of joy in interacting and teaching and I don't know. So that was a really big hit too, a few months ago. And I still have a lot of moments where I just miss a lot of all of that. And, I want to have another go at it. Mm-hmm. So part of, the drive when I'm working on slogging through some parts of this for the September show is that after the show's up in September, we're going to look for our next rescue pup. Yay! So, and I've been doing a lot of reading up on and listening to things about dog training because that's just really satisfying and interesting to me that, positive motivation in life in general. Mm-hmm. And that plays into a lot of things. I mean, there's also parenting and just interacting with other people and how do you want to be in the world?
Well, I was just going to say, the world will always throw you a brick wall, and as artists, we have to deal with it. Our dog passing away is probably hard for you to come in and start working. How do you overcome a creative block?
So, deadlines. I often am very grateful for deadlines. Some of them I set for myself, some of them are external. but getting into the rhythm of just coming in and making the work feels better. I don't know, whenever there's procrastination going on in any realm, I feel like just taking that first little step is huge. And sometimes just come into the space, start working on a thing. Again, I always seem to have ideas of things I'd like to do. So I feel like I don't always have the energy and the time to do what I want to do, but I have the enthusiasm and the curiosity, and that's what keeps me going, I think. Mm-hmm. And I hope that that's what kind of comes through with the work too, that it's sort of, that's the place it comes from. Curiosity and, wanting to see what can I do with this stuff. And it's partly that this is a pretty new art form in a lot of ways. So it's a lot of just playing around and seeing what I can do.
Now, what other advice would you give to somebody who's trying to build on fiber sculpting? And would you recommend going to school? Or are there classes in this subject? My path to this was not, it was more of bringing together a lot of, a lifetime of other experimenting with other techniques and materials. I think you don't necessarily need a formal education as long as sometimes the first step is knowing what questions you have so you can figure out what answers you need to get. And I think it was, I guess I should backtrack and say it probably was my lifelong education in other art techniques and curiosity about other techniques that led me to be able to do what I'm doing with this material. But you can learn that in a lot of different ways. You don't have to be blazing a path to learn things. You can also learn, studying from the masters where you're trying to, recreate brushstroke by brushstroke is a way that people have learned about making art throughout history, because that puts you in the footsteps and lets you pay attention to different things and learn that way. But I think it really helped me as far as being a professional artist, besides the honing my craft, joining in this the nonprofit art performance space, helping run it, taught me the business side of being an artist. Because when I was in school, that was not something they focused on. There was very little talk about presenting your work or, how to be a professional artist, because it involves a lot of things, a lot of strong communication skills. You need to be able to photograph your work or have it photographed so you can communicate it to other people. Mm-hmm. You have to be able to write about it. Mm-hmm. You have to get comfortable, ultimately, talking to people about it or being in front of groups and being organized. And a lot of that kind of stuff I learned on the job by helping, volunteering, running Work San Jose. And I know that there are a lot of other artists, especially here in San Jose, who've done the same thing, who've learned by helping run it. It's been around for 40 some years, but it also connects you to the other people around you. I went to school up in Oregon, so when I came back down to the Bay Area, I didn't really have any art connections. And so basically having the guts to just throw yourself in and how can I help? What can I learn? I think it takes an openness to learning and seeing, not just what you can learn from others, but what you can contribute as you learn. Mm-hmm. It's not just a taking, it's a give and take. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I do. I try to have some presence on social media because it's a way to introduce new people to what I'm doing. But it also feels in some ways like I hope in its best case that it's also some forming of community, because I often will show this is how I'm making this thing. And I saw various sources said, well, if you're trying to sell your work, then you shouldn't be talking about how you make it, because then you're only reaching other artists, and other artists are not going to be the ones buying your work. And I cry foul on both of those. First of all, you don't have to just talk about and show finished work to try to attract collectors. I think lots of people are curious and interested in how things are made. And you can connect with people through that means. But also, discounting the fact that artists might buy other artists' work is sort of silly too, because there's so many silly beliefs about who artists are and how they are and what they do. And so I do feel like it's a way to create some community by finding other things that I think are highly interesting and hopefully putting things out there that help teach or, just connect people to what it takes to make things. I think a lot, that's why I do open studios too. I really like to let people see that actual human beings are making these things and working through how to make things and why, and experimenting with
how you interpret the world. But I think there's plenty of people that don't even realize that.
Mm-hmm.
And you're surrounded by things that were touched by artists. Not everybody calls themselves an artist, even if they make and design and arrange things. But I want to widen the definition of it and make it feel more inclusive, because I think it is.
And I will also say that I believe that felt sculpting is accessible. If you go to any craft store, there's always a kit somewhere. I personally have never done it myself. I have my other fiber arts that I do, but I'm sure after this interview I'm going to go buy one and just see what it's like. It seems very stimulating and therapeutic and creative at the same time. So I'm really honored to be here to interview you, who's mastered this creative art. How do you handle criticism? I know in your art form, I'm sure a lot of people have said, I don't get it.
Yeah, not everybody's gonna get it, and that's okay. That's the other thing with social media. For all the positive things, if there's someone who says a trolly comment, well, should I give more credence to one or the other? Like, if you're gonna let mean comments take you down, then you also probably shouldn't be putting that much attention into the positive comments. So trying to just stay on your road, regardless of what is being said, positive or negative, is something you have to cultivate and work on. I still work on it. But, I think it's very clear that not everything everybody creates is going to appeal to others. And that's just how it is. I can't please everybody. I think as long as I'm pleasing myself, that's the most important thing. I mean, I'm sort of taking the long view on this. I'm continuing to create, bodies of work that are meaningful to me. And I don't know, it's not my job to decide how worthy they are. There's going to be, you want to get critical attention for your work, but you also don't get to decide what that is. Mm-hmm. So my job is to keep, following what I feel like I need to do and laying down the road as I go. Mm-hmm. Trying to practice having a thick skin when you need it.
All right, master of the fiber sculpting. Time to clear the air. Is there any misconceptions about your craft?
Oh, yeah. There's a lot, I think. That it's like, first of all, that it's cutesy-wootsy, like little toys and dolls, not serious, not, that it's almost that it's too accessible. Because if just anybody can do it, then how could it be an art form? Which is ridiculous. But so I think there's also some, the fact that it is fairly repetitive and just takes a lot of hand labor and time is one of those things that can be looked at by the fine art side as, well, that means it's not, it's not a spontaneous gestural whatever. So, and I think there's also the misconception that it's, that I don't know if it's seen more as easy or difficult. It kind of depends on the patience that you have. I think that when people first try it, if they get, little kits, usually it's making a really small thing that could fit in the palm of your hand. That's almost more difficult than working larger because there's just no there. And you have to have a lot of patience when you're learning a new thing anyway, but especially with this, you have to have the patience and the curiosity to push through the fact that it takes a lot of time. And I think a lot of people shoot themselves in the foot by not being willing to be bad at something long enough to be able to get good at it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's sort of a blessing to not know anything about something because that means you get to start from zero and figure it out and learn it. But I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable with not being good at something. Mm-hmm. And if they don't get it quickly, then they bail on it. And this is something that takes time. Mm-hmm. It just does. But if you stick with it, it's very rewarding. I mean, especially when you're first forming something from loose, fluffy nothing. If you stick with it long enough, it feels at first like nothing is happening. Nothing is changing. I'm stabbing into this thing and nothing's happening except maybe I'm stabbing my fingers. But you get to a point where suddenly every single poke you make makes a difference and it gets really satisfying. But you have to get to that point. When I teach classes, it's usually week-long workshops. And I have to try to slow people down because they're so excited to do as much as they can. They're going to hurt their arms by working too hard, too fast. I mean, there is some repetitive stress danger, and you have to, I mean, I mix it up. What I'm working on any given day, you know, I do a mix between, you know, working on this piece over here, doing another kind of motion over there. Frankly, a lot of my life also is communicating on the computer more than I would like.
I'm sure if you accidentally poke yourself, there goes half your day.
Oh gosh, I don't do it too badly. It's more when I'm stitching now that I'll poke myself, and that really hurts. But I can mostly avoid bleeding on things at this point.
I was wondering where all that pink glow
Yeah,
came from.
right.
Well, I really hope that to all my peekers out there, you have the opportunity to look up some of Stephanie Metz's work, because it's beautiful, it's gorgeous. The textures, the colors, the shapes. I've said it many times during this episode, but it just evokes a feeling, and I really hope that you get to experience it. And whether that be in person or just some pictures, I'm sure you will absolutely love it. But what's next for the world of your craft? I love the quote that you had earlier, every poke makes a difference. So what's next for Stephanie Metz? What's the difference that you're going to make in this world?
Well, I think bringing it as much as possible to a wider audience as an art form is important. For the show that had my hanging pods at the Brattleboro Museum, it was 5 of us. It was called Felt Experience. 5 artists who work with felt in different ways. I think that fiber-related arts are starting to have a moment, starting to finally be acknowledged more. I mean, there's been different times, that it's been more acceptable in the canon of art, and I think it's coming around again. I like the idea of people being more exposed to a wider range of what you can use to express yourself visually and sculpturally. As to what, I don't know where, like with the needle felting, I think there are more and more people that are aware of it and using it in really interesting ways. So I'm really happy to see, more and more innovation with it. I don't know where overall it could go, but I know that I'm going to keep on experimenting with various things.
Yeah, you mentioned AI a little bit ago, but after a few interviews, several interviews, I've just learned that most artists believe that no matter what, art will always have that human touch.
Yeah, I think it's a passing fad, to be honest with you. We don't need things that simplify and streamline the good parts of life of making things. We need to streamline the stupid little jobs that getting your dishes done. I feel like it's sort of a mistake to try to use technology to do these creative endeavors, because that is what makes people feel alive and present. And why would you replace that? I don't know.
Well, I think what you just said is very evident in your work. And what's next for you personally?
Yeah, well, first I'm working to get this show finished, and it'll be up at the Triton Museum in Santa Clara from September 14th through December 29th. So it's a good 3-month long run. But then it's like, okay, especially with that huge thing, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to find other venues for it? Am I going to cut it down into smaller things? I don't even know. I have all these scraps of this unique material, so I'm pretty excited to play with other ways of making form with it. But I'm not exactly sure. As I mentioned, I'm going to get a puppy and spend some dedicated time doing some socializing of a new dog, and I'm not sure yet. I can assure you that I will be making more things. I don't know what yet.
That's fantastic. I'm so excited. And where can we see your work?
So online, my website is stephaniemetz.com. And then I also have a presence on Instagram at Stephanie_Metz_sculpture. And on TikTok, I put pretty much the same things on both, but it reaches different audiences, which is interesting. And then I have a YouTube channel, also Stephanie Metz Sculpture. So I try to, be fairly regular-ish with sharing process and finished pieces and things that way, because I think it's an interesting way to meet people where they are, especially if they can't see a thing in person. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you enough for joining me and piquing my interest. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Just to lean into wonder and curiosity, because I think that is a big part of what makes people feel alive and connected. So pay attention to what you pay attention to and realize there's value in that because it caught your attention. It piqued your interest.
Fantastic. And I also end with one question. If you could excel at any craft other than your own, what would you want to do?
I'm pretty interested in wood carving.
Ooh.
And I've done a little bit of it, but I would like to have somehow the time to do more of that. And part of that involves being better at sharpening the carving tools. But I'm interested in that.
There's no wood needles.
No, but there are.
Do you think you'd
chisels.
ever combine wood sculpting with fiber sculpting?
Possibly. I've done a lot of combining, like metal mesh, like things where you can pierce through it to join things together, but there's no reason, not to.
Or I've seen a lot of chainsaw log sculptures with critters.
Oh yeah.
Do some kind of collaboration somewhere.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to join softer material to harder material, and so that's definitely an area that I could play with more.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you to all my peekers out there. Please let me know if you know of any special or unique artists or art forms you think I should explore. I'm currently in San Jose, California, and cannot wait to see where Pique My Interest takes me next. Remember, creativity comes from the heart. Push yourselves. Be kind to each other. I'm Scoob Decker, and thank you for helping me pique my interest.